This is The First Century, a podcast devoted to stories from that influential period of history including Rome, Judea, Christianity, and more. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Schmisek. Get ready to go back in time and enter a world before computers, the stagecoach, the printing press, or even stirrups had been invented for horses. We're about to enter the first century. Episode 6. The Death of Lucius and Gaius, Octavian's grandsons, and Revolts in Judea. In 2 CE, Augustus's 19-year-old grandson Lucius died of a sudden illness on the way to join the Roman legions in Hispania. This created a precarious succession situation, made even more so 18 months later when the other of Augustus's grandsons, Gaius, died in the east of an illness. Gaius had been sent there by the princeps as governor of Syria, and due to his young age, he'd been accompanied on his sojourn by experts, such as his tutor Quirinius, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who had been a successful general in Germania, and an up-and-coming advisor by the name of Sejanus. When Gaius died, he left behind his wife, Claudia Livia, as a 17-year-old widow. Not only was she part of the imperial family, but she was also known for her remarkable beauty. She remarried the same year Gaius died, this time to Drusus, Tiberius' son. The Roman crowds wanted Julia back in the city, and they would shout for her return. Augustus is said to have replied, "May the gods curse you with daughters as lecherous as mine, and with wives as adulterous." After her initial 5-year exile, Augustus allowed Julia to move back to the mainland, to Rhegium, on the toe of the boot of the Italian peninsula, and on Messina Straits. She was given an allowance and permitted to walk around the town, but she was not allowed back in Rome. With his oldest grandsons now dead, and his daughter still exiled, Augustus finally allowed Tiberius to return from Rhodes, and then formally adopted him in 4 CE, making him heir along with Augustus's sole surviving grandson, Marcus Agrippa Postumus, who, unfortunately for his own sake, was not living up to imperial standards in his grandfather's eyes. At the time, Augustus wondered about naming the dashing young Germanicus as heir, but Livia's influence was real. She encouraged Augustus to name her biological son Tiberius as heir, and then he in turn would adopt his nephew Germanicus. Tiberius was happy to be called back to Rome, and he was sure to bring Thrasyllus with him, as the astrologer had foreseen this fortunate event. In 6 CE, Tiberius declared Germania pacified, and at his recommendation, Augustus made Varus, former governor of Syria, the first officially appointed governor of the newly created Roman province of Germania. That same year, 6 CE, the Judean people and the Samaritans were complaining about the rule of Archelaus. These historic enemies, the Judeans and the Samaritans, made common cause and sent a delegation to Rome with a list of grievances about Archelaus, in particular, his cruelty and tyranny, as they put it. Archelaus was considered by the Romans to be a complete failure. Augustus summoned him to Rome, deposed him as a leader, and sent him to Gaul. Augustus made the diminutive Judea into an imperial rather than senatorial province, meaning that Augustus would have control via a prefect, someone chosen from the equestrian ranks and commanding auxiliary rather than regular troops. Although its own imperial province, Judea and its prefect would still be under the guidance of the province of Syria with its governor, who had consular standing and 3 regular legions. Augustus appointed Quirinius, tutor of the deceased Gaius and respected Roman senator, to be the legate governor of Syria, with orders to assess the province for the purposes of taxation. Antipas and Philip were allowed to rule over their smaller regions, but still under Roman domination and occupation. Antipas was even given the honorary title of Herod, but not the title king. Quirinius traveled to Judea, since it had been recently added to the province of Syria. He intended to carry out the census and manage the financial affairs of Archelaus, the deposed ruler. As an aside, this is the same census mentioned in the Gospel of Luke, which he says was the reason that Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem. You'll recall that last episode we mentioned the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE. The Gospel of Matthew places the birth of Jesus about 2 to 3 years prior to the death of Herod the Great. So to be clear, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are inconsistent when it comes to dating the birth of Jesus. Matthew says Jesus would have been born about 2 to 3 years prior to the death of Herod, whereas Luke says Jesus was born about the time of the census. In effect, the two Gospels are about 12 years apart on the dating of Jesus' birth. But back to the census. Initially, the Jews reacted strongly against the idea of taxation, viewing it as offensive and oppressive. However, the high priest persuaded them to cooperate, and thanks to his influence, the people agreed to report their property and wealth. But not everyone accepted this peacefully. A man named Judas from the city of Gamala in Galilee joined forces with Zadok, a Pharisee, and began rallying people to rebel. They argued that the census was just a step toward slavery, and urged the nation to fight for their freedom. They claimed that God alone was their ruler, and that it was not permitted to pay taxes to the Romans. They were therefore opposed to the census, which had taxes as its very purpose. They promised that by resisting, the people would not only protect their possessions, but they would also gain honor and glory for their courage. God would only help them if they united and took bold action for their own benefit, especially if they committed to great deeds and would not give up. Judas and Zadok inspired many followers, and their movement grew rapidly. But not everyone agreed with their point of view, including the high priest, as mentioned above. Some did register for the census and pay their taxes, but that it only invoked the wrath of Judas and his gang. They burned the houses of those accomplices and collaborators to send a message to any others who might consider paying their taxes. The cry was, "No king but God." Their teachings spread like wildfire, especially among the youth, and soon the nation was overwhelmed by conflict and widespread chaos. There were internal divisions among the people, violence, and even assassinations. Robbery and murder became rampant, even targeting prominent leaders. There was a famine, cities were destroyed, and eventually the temple itself was burned by enemy forces. The traditional customs and values of the Jewish people were overturned, and that upheaval pushed the nation closer to ruin. Though the rebels claimed to act for the public good, many thought that their true motive was personal gain. Roman power, of course, did not take kindly to tax protesters, especially those who assaulted the tax-paying public. Ultimately, Judas and his band met a violent end at the hand of Roman military power, but his movement persisted and morphed into what was known as the Zealot Party, which had never existed before. It attracted many followers and caused major disruptions in the government. Though it seemed like a call for liberty, it would ultimately lay the groundwork for future disasters. Having settled the rebellion, Quirinius then appointed Ananus, son of Seth, as high priest. Ananus, his 5 sons, and even his son-in-law Caiaphas would all serve as high priest over a period that spanned many decades. But now with Tiberius back in the good graces of the emperor, and Germania declared pacified, Augustus sent him in 6 CE to quash a rebellion in Illyricum, modern-day Bosnia, northern Albania. The resistance proved difficult, and so the following year Augustus also sent Germanicus, known also for his military acumen, as support and assistance for Tiberius. Postumus, Augustus's only remaining grandson and named heir along with Tiberius, was overlooked for the military campaign because of his reckless, selfish ways and atrocious attitude. In fact, Augustus was so disenchanted by Postumus that he revoked his being heir and banished him to an area near Pompeii. It's also said that Livia, Tiberius's mother, did not like Postumus and saw him as a potential threat to her own son, especially when they were each named co-heirs. With Livia's counsel ever present to Augustus, perhaps it's not surprising that 1 year later, Augustus went even further and asked the Senate to make Postumus's banishment permanent. and the Senate did just that. Postumus was then exiled to a small, rocky island between Italy and Corsica. And to ensure that the exile would be permanent, Augustus also stationed a squad of infantry there. About the same time, Julia the exile's daughter, referred to as Julia the Younger, was also exiled for violating the morality laws, the same conviction that her mother had faced earlier. Julia the Younger was skating on thin ice with her grandfather Augustus. Not long before, she had built an ostentatious house in the country. We recall from Augustus's treatment of Pollio that he looked down on public displays of wealth and pretension. And so, he had Julia the Younger's country house demolished. Now, she would be exiled due to adultery. Unfortunately for her, she was pregnant at the time. Shortly after she arrived on the island of her exile, she gave birth. But Augustus would not allow the father to visit, and he ordered the child to be exposed, that is, exposed to the elements and left to die, which was an accepted practice in Roman antiquity, even though it was effectively infanticide. Germanicus had a younger brother, Claudius, who had been born in 10 BCE and was betrothed to Julia the Younger's daughter, Aemilia Lepida, Augustus's first great-grandchild. But when Julia the Younger was exiled, the betrothal was nullified too. Things were not easy for Claudius. As a young child, he had come down with a sickness that left him with a limp and hard of hearing. This partial deafness contributed to a speech impediment as well, to say nothing of his tendency to drool. His own mother, Antonia, called him, quote, a monster, a man whom nature had begun to work upon, but then flung aside, end quote. When she wanted to insult someone and belittle their intelligence, she would say, "He's a bigger fool even than my son Claudius." His grandmother, Livia, also held him in low regard and deep scorn. Claudius's sister Livilla once heard someone predict that Claudius would hold power, and she prayed aloud that the Roman people would be spared such a cruel and undeserved misfortune. With a family like this, who would need enemies? It was determined that Claudius would do well with a life of the mind. So in 7 CE, Livy was hired to tutor Claudius in history. Livy himself was a historian and wrote a multi-volume history of Rome entitled From the Founding of the City. As the title suggests, he started with the founding of Rome and carried history down to his present day with the reign of Augustus. Being on good terms with the imperial family certainly helped, and he was only too happy to tutor Claudius, who became something of a historian himself. So, with his first engagement annulled, due to no fault of his own, it was then arranged for Claudius to marry Camilla, the daughter of Marcus Furius Camillus, consul in CE 8 and a close friend of Tiberius. However, Camilla died of an illness on her wedding day. So in 9 CE, the 18-year-old Claudius married Plautia Urgulanilla, whose father had won a triumph and whose grandmother was close to Livia. As something of a bookworm and budding scholar, Claudius had been working on his own version of history, with Livy's encouragement. On one occasion, a number of guests were called together to hear Claudius's reading of it. His speech impediment caused great difficulty for him, but not as much difficulty as laughter, because shortly after he started, one of the guests, an obese man, broke the bench that he was sitting on. Even after guests took their places again and arrangements were made for a stronger seat for the man, Claudius kept giggling as he remembered the fall each time he glanced at him. Next time, we'll learn about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest.